Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
And the callousness of the East German guards was extraordinary. For instance, one occasion, a young lad had slipped into the Teltow Canal, which was a border, and the East German guards didn't bother to rescue him. West Germans couldn't get to him, so he drowned.
Former MI6 Director David Bickford takes us behind the scenes of one of the most unusual and precarious postings of the Cold War. Arriving in Berlin in 1979, the city is still technically under Allied occupation, surrounded by East Germany and governed through a complex web of agreements dating back to the Second World War. He recounts the day-to-day realities of maintaining access routes into the city, negotiating with the Soviets without the backing of force, and managing constant disputes over transport, tariffs and air corridors. Against the background of rising tensions following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, David reveals how fragile the balance really was and how close things could come to escalation. With vivid personal memories, this episode offers a rare human perspective on life at the front line of the Cold War. I'm delighted to welcome David Bickford to our Cold War conversation.
My father left the RAF after the war, and he joined up with a friend of his in the RAF, and they set up an international airline going from the UK to South America. So he went there when I was about 6, 7. He took the South American end. So I was pretty independent from that time on. I went to boarding school, which was great. Lived with my grandparents and godparents during the holidays, except for the summer holiday when I went out to visit them. So my first aircraft trip was on a converted bomber. Took hours and hours, and one was sent off with one's label, arrived. So that was really my upbringing, very independent and difficult with authority because nobody was around to actually give me any discipline at all because the parents were away. My grandparents and godparents are very lenient. I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. My uncle was the defense lawyer for Ruth Ellis, who was the last person to be hanged. And I thought that would be a very exciting career. So I went into private practice. I looked at private practice and found that I was looking at the consultant partner who'd just been buried, then the senior partner, the junior partner, the assistant partner, and me. And I thought this is going to take years to get anywhere. So then my wife said, look, there's a job going out in the Turks and Caicos Islands as the government legal advisor. Why don't you take it? So I went out there, and that was very interesting because it was at the time when the islands were setting up a tourist business and also finance center. The ministers there were very advanced in their thinking, and so they gave one a very exciting time doing that. A lot of things with the Americans, particularly on drugs, transiting through the Caribbean, dealing with the FBI. Then the Foreign Office asked if I'd join them as a legal advisor. I joined them, did human rights work, defense work, a lot of defense work, and space, which was at its forefront those days, just beginning space law. And I went to Berlin for 3 years, which is what we will chat about. And then when I came back, I did a lot of more work with the Americans and defense. And I was asked if I'd join the intelligence agencies as their legal director, which I did. And that was yet another exciting part of my career.
Indeed. You briefly mentioned there you were working on space law. Could you just give me a little bit more detail as to what you were working on and who you were having to negotiate that with?
Yes, we were negotiating with the Russians, the Americans, the French, in terms of the European Space Agency. And in particular, we set up the beginnings of the International Space Station. It took years for that agreement to actually mature, but the foundation of it I was involved in as representing the British element of it, which was absolutely fascinating because the first thing one had to do was who owned the space station. And we decided the best thing to do, particularly with the Russians involved, because this is still in the Cold War then, that we would each own a part of the space station and be responsible for exactly what we all actually did on the space station, launching it and all the rest of it. Very interesting. So now when I look up in the sky and see it going by every now and again, one has the satisfaction of thinking I was part of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was your first taste of negotiating with the Soviets as well.
Yes, it was. Yeah, very interesting. And what one learned with the Soviets to expect when one had actually thought one had agreed something, that they would come back with a couple of extra points. Fortunately, I'd learned that dealing with the Americans when I was in the Turks and Caicos Islands. I was involved in an agreement to be able to use their air base there. And I discovered then that the Americans do exactly the same thing. You consider you've finished the agreement and they'll come up with another couple of extra points. Dealing with the Americans and the Russians, one always had a couple of extra papers in one's briefcase.
And that experience obviously helped you in Berlin. Now, you're in Berlin as legal advisor and you're part of the British military government. Can you just explain what the British military government was?
Yeah, try and do that very briefly. After the war, Berlin was made an occupied city between the Russians, Americans, British, and French. And it sat right in the middle of what we now know as East Germany. So there had to be agreements to be able to reach Berlin, to supply the Berliners, to allow them to move in and out. So 3 corridors were set up and a quadripartite government was set up. And that was called the occupation government. That government continued all the way through to when I was there in 79 to 83. So Berlin was still technically an occupied city. There'd been an agreement in 1971 to try and govern how Berliners and the Allies could use those very vital corridors to supply Berlin. Everything had to be bought in for a large population. And the British military government was the civilian wing of the occupation, as opposed, if you like, to the military wing. And the civilian wing dealt with the Berlin mayor, who was the civilian government of Berlin, and also with the Russians directly. The reason we had to deal with the Russians was, although Berlin by that time had been split into West Germany and East Germany, the Western powers didn't recognize East Germany as a state. They only recognized the Russians as being in control of East Germany. So that's why we dealt entirely with the Russians, which was quite interesting because the East Germans, of course, were always causing trouble to try and establish themselves as a state in the eyes of the world. So that was the job of the British military government.
Had you been to Berlin before, or was this your first time in Berlin?
No, it was my first time in Berlin. I hadn't been there before. One was thrown in the deep end, in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And can you describe your arrival, how you got to Berlin, and what your first impressions were?
Yeah, I must say it was like nothing one had ever seen in one's life. And as I say, I traveled a lot, seen a lot, but this was completely different. The first experience is going up the road corridor. We went by road to Berlin on our first trip. First of all, you have to get permission to go up the corridor through East Germany. You're going through alien territory. So you have to get all your paperwork in a right order. That's issued to you. When you go up the corridor, the first thing you notice is that it's very bleak. It's very flat. The whole place is bleak. You're not allowed to stop on the corridor. That was prohibited. So whatever happened, you had to keep going. That sort of feeling of we mustn't stop, we mustn't stop. Then the other instruction one was issued with going up the corridor was that you weren't allowed to leave it. You had to follow the directions to West Berlin, absolutely. If you came off the corridor, off the roadway, you would immediately be picked up either by the East Germans or by the Russians, and then you'd have all the problems of getting out of that particular situation. So, in a sense, there was that tingle of going up. Then one reached the border between West Berlin and East Germany. Now, that was the first time one saw the fortifications that the Germans had introduced between West Germany and East Germany. And they were quite extraordinary. There were Goonie towers, East German guards and machine guns. The first thing you had to do when you saw that wall was to find the blockhouse where the Russian officer was that you had to report to with your paperwork. Armed Russian guards were outside that blockhouse. One went into the blockhouse and it was absolutely empty, except on the far wall there was a sort of slot in the wall where you saw a Russian officer sitting, and he would sort of hold out his hand, wouldn't say a word. You'd have to pass over your documents. Now, all this was designed to make us all very uneasy. So you'd hand over your documents, and of course there was no problem of the documents being looked at and handed back immediately. They'd pore over them and point to bits and pieces, and you'd think, oh, I wonder if I've got that wrong. Then eventually you'd get your documents handed back, and then one would pass through the chicane, the killing ground, where East Germans, or East Berliners, if they tried to escape, could be shot still at that time. And you passed into West Berlin. And that was a massive change, because there you came into a Western capitalist town at the height of capitalism, if you like. It was a showcase for capitalism. Shops, people in the streets, very expensive cars, whereas on the Autobahn coming up, you only ever saw East German cars. So that was a massive shock.
What could the civilian government, like the Berlin mayor, do? Did they always have to ask permission from the British military government to enact any local laws or anything like that?
Yeah, they had a certain amount of autonomy, but they were not allowed to pass any regulations that contravened the agreements that we had with the Russians. So when, for instance, the East Germans increased tariffs that West Germans had to pay, or West Berliners had to pay to go into the East, it was the Allies who had to deal with that, not the West Berlin government, not the West Berlin mayor. So there were always discussions going on with the mayor, because the East Germans were continually causing problems. For instance, they caused problems on the S-Bahn, which was the local rail network, and also with the network going through East Germany to West Germany, which they also controlled. The West Berliners had boycotted that system for many years. Then suddenly in 1980, the West Berlin element of the S-Bahn all went on strike. So massive problems there. Nobody could get around Berlin. Buses had to be introduced or increased. That was the sort of area in which we were involved directly with the Russians, trying to sort that out.
Yeah, the whole status of the S-Bahn is really unusual, because the lines and the infrastructure treated as extraterritorial areas of East Germany in West Berlin, or not?
They were run by East Germany, and they looked after the rails, they looked after the running of it. So I wouldn't call it extraterritorial, no. But what it was, they were permitted, obviously, to run it. And there were constant disputes over how they ran it, because they had no money to run it properly. There was always breaking down. And as I say, it was boycotted to a large extent by the West Berliners. That was an argument that went way, way back when the East Germans increased transit fees, and the West Berliners decided to go into a boycott in protest against that. So it was quite a weird situation. The other thing, obviously, we used to get involved in, where the West Berliners were involved, was transit routes. Goods could be held up on the rail, or air flights coming through the corridors could be interfered with. Road transport, lorries could be inspected. And all sorts of those difficulties were cropping up almost daily that we had to deal with.
How did you go about resolving these issues? You had to go through the Russians, who then spoke to the East Germans, and it was a very roundabout route.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, the problem was you had no ability to use force to back up what you were doing. There was no way you could send in the tanks in, in West Berlin. So one had to negotiate with the Russians on the basis of one hand tied behind one's back. So it was a matter of protest. It was a matter of, do you really want all these problems to subsist? Because it means we're taking up your time, you're having to deal with them, and can't you control your East German friends? You know perfectly well that the agreements provide that we do have this access, we're entitled to this access, and therefore it was a matter of persuasion rather than force.
Yeah, I guess there was always going to be a fear that they would stop the transit routes and you'd have another Berlin airlift, Berlin blockade situation.
At the back of one's mind, that was the end game, yes, and the Russians obviously played to that. But then, of course, there were wider political ramifications that were involved in that as well. So one had to liaise with the government in Bonn, which was the capital then of West Germany, and we had our own embassy there, and one liaised with them about these issues. So there was pressure coming from the embassy there, pressure coming from the embassy in East Berlin, and pressure from us.
Can you remember the first time you met the Soviets you were going to have to deal with in Berlin?
Yeah, I do. I remember that very well, actually, because that was at Spandau Prison. It was actually, funnily enough, the first time, because an incident had occurred just after I got there. The lawyers were in overall charge of the prison. This was part of the Nuremberg trials after the war, which was a legal process, and the lawyers were responsible for the prison and the prisoners. But there were also governors who did the day-to-day work. The governor was away at that particular time. I was called in the middle of the night by the Russian governor to say that a bomb had been placed there by a Croatian cook, and they were searching for it. And therefore the governors had to join in and do the search because the governors were in charge of the prison. So anyway, off I go in the middle of the night, and we searched around in the loft for this thing. Of course, at the end of that, I think the Russian governor was quite amused because we all had a vodka in the bar there after all this had happened. And he said, of course, we searched this place thoroughly before you came, but he said, we thought you needed to do your duty. So that was the first time there was a typical sort of Russian sense of humor about the whole issue. At the time, it wasn't very amusing. So that's the first time I met the Russians in Berlin. Obviously, I'd met them before in negotiations. I always found that one could get on very well with the Russians. One had to lay off because one knew exactly what they would do if they tried to trick you into anything. But you could get on with the Russians. They had a good sense of humor. Quite often they'd be very depressed with this very Russian sort of personality. They can be up and down. But they were very tough in Spandau, but that goes on to, of course, the question of Hess, who was the lone prisoner there. The extraordinary situation where you had a jail for 600 people that was absolutely empty, except for Hess, who'd been sentenced to life imprisonment, and he was kept there as the sole prisoner.
Rudolf Hess was a convicted war criminal and leading member of the Nazi Party in Germany. He was deputy to the Führer Adolf Hitler in 1933, and he held that position until 1941, when he flew solo to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate the United Kingdom's exit from the Second World War. He was taken prisoner and eventually convicted of crimes against peace. He was serving his life sentence at Spandau Prison and died by suicide in 1987. I have a couple of episodes with people who met with Hess at Spandau Prison. There'll be links to those episodes in the episode information. So the time you're there is round about the time the Russians have invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So there are tensions between East and West there. So were you working on like confidence building between the two sides?
We'd, of course, withdrawn all contact with the Russians when they went into Afghanistan. That was December 1979. And that made life very difficult indeed, particularly in terms of keeping the corridors going, because there was a real fear that the Russians would actually interfere severely with the corridors and prevent either air traffic or rail or road traffic there. Therefore, there were sub-rosa contacts, of course, with the Russians to ensure, via the Berlin Air Safety Committee, and which looked after the corridors, and also within Spandau, to make sure that those corridors were kept open. What was very interesting was that after a particular time, we decided that, or London decided that there should be some sort of détente with the Russians after that invasion of Afghanistan. And funnily enough, I was involved as the lawyer, largely because diplomats can always put lawyers up front for any sort of détente, because if things go wrong, then because it's nothing to do with the politics, it's to do with the lawyers who can get it wrong. We were asked by London to invite the Russian military and Russian military government to our house for a reception. It was a dinner, in fact, break the ice. This was a personal invitation. And we invited them and their wives, and of course our own side and their wives, as a sort of to make this a real reception rather than a political détente move. So the Russians all arrived, but they didn't bring their wives. And by that time, of course, knew them well enough and said, "Why aren't your wives here?" No, they said, far too tempting for them to come to West Berlin and the shops. On the other side of that, it's quite curious because they came in their ZIL limos and they lined up outside our house, which actually could cause quite a stir amongst our West Berlin neighbors, who were pretty shocked to see a whole line of Russian cars coming in with Russian military and civilian personnel. The drivers were all left in the cars. It was a freezing night. And we asked my son, who was about 7, I think, at that time, to go out to ask the drivers whether they'd want any coffee. They refused to speak to him. They just kept the windows shut. And he came back and he said, "They won't speak to me." We said, "There you go. That's Russian freedom for you."
You were provided with accommodation in Berlin.
Yeah.
What was that like, and what area was that in?
Yeah, funnily enough, the lawyers had what they called a representational house, because one was there to represent the Allies in Berlin for a number of reasons. If you like, it was to make sure that one could meet up, certainly with the West Berliners and West Berlin government officials and West Berlin businessmen, lawyers, to talk informally with them or to chat informally with them, to make friends as well, to find out how they were getting on. Because as in any form of government, if you're not in touch with the people on the ground, you can sit in an ivory tower by just talking to your other government representatives. You've got to know the people around. So, yeah, it was a representational house. It was a Bauhaus, which was quite interesting. There were 4 houses in Berlin that were designed, I've forgotten by which architect, but it was a very famous architectural period in Berlin in the 1930s, where you got these very square buildings. And in the dining room, there was a circle cut out of the floor, went down to the kitchens where you could actually have your meal put on it, and that circle would come all the way up and would form a table. It was an absolutely extraordinary situation. It didn't work while we were there, fortunately. So, yes, it was in the American sector, curiously enough, out by the Grunewald, which was a very wooded area. Berlin is a very wooded city. In a way, a bit like London, sort of big parks, but huge parks. Grunewald have a massive lakes, And it was very popular with the West Berliners to go out to.
I remember when I was in West Berlin, I was surprised at the size of it and how rural some areas were that you could find, particularly up in the north. I think there was a village called Lubas
Yes.
there, and that was almost like you were on a farm somewhere.
Yeah,
it was bizarre.
Yeah. No, we had some German friends who actually lived up in the north in Frenau. And that was extraordinary because there was a piece of woodland there when the birds never sang. And it was a spot where I think there'd been a massacre towards the end of the war. And interestingly enough, that was just the place where two East Germans, a young lad and his girlfriend, had tried to get across the wall. He'd got over and he was hauling her up and she got shot, so she was killed, it shook up the friends of ours quite considerably because they heard the shots, that the house was so near to the wall. Yes.
Wow. How much were you involved in, or did you ever see anything like that where there were escapes into the British sector or something like that, where you had to deal with anything in those situations?
Yeah, so one was immediately involved in issuing the protests. That was, what one could do. It was to protest at the grotesque killing on the wall. We had, one way or another, I think there were six major incidents while I was there. And the callousness of the East German guards was extraordinary. For instance, one occasion, a young lad had slipped into the canal on the East German side into the Teltow Canal, which was a border, and the East German guards didn't bother to rescue him. West Germans couldn't get to him, so he drowned. And that sort of callousness was every day in East Berlin, and when one went over there, one saw it and felt it.
Yeah, because I seem to think that and this may not have been during your time, but the British sort of put ladders into the spray in their zone near the Reichstag to help anybody escaping get out of the river.
Yes.
And there was a protest, I think, from the East Germans or the Soviets around that.
Yes, and that was either before or after, probably before my time, actually. I don't recall that. But we were in a position of protesting very much.
You mentioned 6 major incidents. Were the other ones similar to the ones that you described just a moment ago?
Yes, I think there were 2 other shootings. And then there was the balloon incident, where some East Germans actually 2 families crossed over in a balloon, that was over into West Germany there, which was extraordinary. Then, of course, we had the hijack, although from Poland, a man, Tida was his name, and his girlfriend came over from Poland in a Lot airliner and landed at Tempelhof. He'd taken out a toy pistol, which nobody knew was a toy pistol at the time, threatened the pilot, and the pilot had landed the aircraft in West Berlin. And of course, that was at a time when hijacking was at its height, and any hijacker picked up had to be prosecuted. That put the Americans in a complete quandary, because the first thing that the American liaison officer at the airport had done was to greet Tida and his girlfriend with the words, "Welcome to West Berlin," which was a pretty natural thing to do. But, of course, Tida had to be prosecuted for hijacking. That was an extraordinary case because here was someone who'd escaped from the awful communist regime in Poland to get to the West, and yet he was being prosecuted for it. That is any dilemma. That's the dilemma of denying him his rights to freedom in a city that represented freedom in this sea of communism. So the Americans decided they'd set up a an American military court to deal with this because they didn't want the West Berliners to deal with it, obviously, because this was a matter between them and the Russians. The West Berliners couldn't handle an aircraft coming into West Berlin. They couldn't deal with any matter related to that was entirely for the Allies. So they set up this military court and they introduced a judge from America to run it. The American judge was extremely interesting because the first thing he did was to say, you can't have a military court to deal with this. It's got to be a civilian court. And if it's a civilian court, the first thing you must do is to have a jury. And it will have to be a jury of German West Berliners. So the first thing that happens is, of course, you have no real military court. You're having a civil court in Berlin. The next thing this judge did was to say the girlfriend had made a statement admitting hijacking. And she said, well, she wasn't given the usual warnings that would be given if she was in America. Therefore, her confession is ruled out. So she was released immediately. Of course, he presented the case to the West Berlin jury as the rights of Tida to come over from this awful communist state. And were they really going to convict him of hijacking? So they didn't convict him of hijacking, but they did convict him, I think, of brandishing a weapon. He was sentenced to time served. And the interesting end story of that was the very next day, my wife was on the West Berlin committee for the International Bar Association. There was a huge meeting of the world's international lawyers coming into Berlin. She was on the committee, and we were invited to the evening reception to welcome all the international lawyers. Guess who served our table? Tida. He'd been immediately hired as a waiter. And that was
Really?
an extraordinary life one led in Berlin. Yeah.
Wow, that's a brilliant story, that one. Before you came to Berlin, you must have had to do a lot of homework about all the legal agreements and how Berlin worked, or did you pick that up as you went along when you were there?
One knew about the quadripartite agreement, which had been set up in 1971 to try and calm life down, to make some rules as to how the corridors were to be run, what the relationship between East Germany and West Germany were, despite the fact that East Germany was never recognized as a state. So it was a very curious Alice in Wonderland agreement. So one had to familiarize oneself to a certain extent with that. But nothing really prepared oneself for what happened day to day. In the air corridors, for instance, aircraft had to fly at 10,000 feet if they were coming in from the west to Berlin. There was a very narrow corridor, about 20 kilometers wide, if I remember rightly. So they had to stick within that corridor. If they strayed either left or right, then they'd be buzzed by Russian military aircraft. There was an organization called the Berlin Air Safety Committee, and that was housed in a building where the Russians, the Americans, the British, and the French all operated together as air traffic controllers and as the policymakers for running the corridors. The Russians would quite often, at the last minute, say, we're having a Russian military aircraft exercise, therefore your aircraft have to travel higher because we're going to run it at 10,000 feet. Well, that would cause problems because that could cause delays at one end of the corridor or the other. That used to occur quite frequently. And of course, the other problem was that a number of aircraft were sent out to actually survey what was going on either side of the corridor. And if they strayed too far either side of the corridor to take their photographs or conduct their surveillance, then of course the Russian military aircraft would come piling in and buzz them. Yeah, it was an interesting time, particularly at the time of the Afghan war.
Absolutely. I thought that the Soviets had pulled out somewhat out of the 4-power meetings after the Berlin airlift.
Yes, that was before my time, and it was partly that problem that created the need for the 1971 quadripartite agreement. Difficulties were sort of unresolved. They relied on wartime agreements that had been made in haste, very vague provisions in them. For instance, there was a wonderful story of a border dispute up in Qatar, which was where the British had an airport. It was in the British sector. And the Russians claimed that the border was about 100 meters further into the British sector than we decided. And they had a number of disputes over this, guards clashing with each other. That was before the wall actually went up. The dispute was resolved one very hard winter when the snow was down, and the two commanders of either side met up, and they decided the best way to resolve this dispute was to paint a whole load of stones white and to put them down in the snow.
Brilliant. Yeah, nice bit of ambiguity then.
Berlin was full of ambiguity, yes.
The
legal situation was Alice in Wonderland. Everything was smoothed over with words that could mean two things.
Yeah, because I remember there was this weird bit of land in the British sector near Potsdamer Platz, the Lena Triangle.
Yeah.
Which was in the British zone, but was East German territory. But the East Germans hadn't built the wall round it because it would have made a really weird shape. It was a bit of a no man's land, and there were squatters living there because it wasn't really owned by anybody.
Yeah, that was a very typical Berlin situation. I mean, for instance, going through the wall, checkpoint Charlie, which divided East Berlin from West Berlin, was an incredible experience because West Berlin at that time, as I said earlier, was a showcase. Bright lights, neon signs, people bustling, busy, very busy in the sense that it sounds a bit dramatic, but in a sense, they were living for the day. It wasn't real in the sense that one expected the Russian tanks to come in any minute. That wasn't the case. It was the fact that the West Berliners felt very much that they represented the free West. There was a very strong feeling about that. And they made sure that the shops were full, that people could buy what they wanted, that they could show the East Berliners exactly what capitalism was like, what they were missing. When one went to Checkpoint Charlie, one went through the checkpoint on the Allied side, and you crossed it over, and in front of you was a barrier, and then beyond that was the wall, the solid block of wall. Goonie towers looking down, and guards in a sort of guard hut that looked over you. At night, searchlights coming down onto your vehicle as you went through. You crossed over the killing zone, and you reached East Berlin, and there you met the East German border guards. They would check your documents, and civilians had orange cards. They were called orange cards. I still have mine. You weren't allowed to talk to the East German guards, so you were sitting while in your car, they would come up to you. They'd have rifles, weapons, Goonie towers, searchlights, and you'd hold your card up to the window of your car, and they would look at it to determine whether it was you. They'd look at you, look at your card, the photo on your card. Quite often they'd take time. They'd walk around your car, looking at it, looking underneath it. I remember on one occasion, a colleague of mine was driving, and he had his card up at the window, And the guard refused to acknowledge it. And we sat there. He wasn't going to talk to the guard wasn't going to talk to him. And he just looked at it, and we just sat there. If one got into real problems, one wasn't allowed to talk to the East German guards. You had to ask for a Russian officer. That was all you could say to them. I wanted a Russian officer. Then you would deal with the Russian to sort out whatever problem the guard might have. Anyway, finally, the guard pointed at the window and made a circular motion with his finger. And my friend looked at his card and he saw it was upside down. So here you have this. That's the epitome of the Alice in Wonderland situation in Berlin. You got that horror of going through the wall because it was very eerie. You went into East Berlin. There was no light at night. You had sparse street lamps. There was no advertising. There were no shops, of course, just the government shops. Very few people walking in the streets. There was an immediate feeling of fear. And it was more than psychological, it was tangible. The East Berliners would not approach your car. They'd hardly look at it when you were driving through. The feeling of oppression was quite staggering. Yeah.
I vividly remember crossing through Checkpoint Charlie. I can remember all the details. And also I went through Friedrichstrasse as well when I was in Berlin. I wanted to try all the crossings that I was valid for just to get my money's worth out of the full experience.
Yeah.
Now, one of the odd things about Berlin is each side could patrol the other side's sectors. So you had these things called flag tours.
Yeah.
And did you go on one of these for sort of like acclimatization or just seeing what was going on?
Yes, I did. Civilians weren't meant to go out on flag tours. And these were Range Rovers that were black. They had the British flag on them, number plate. And they were permitted to go into East Berlin to tour around, to show the flag, because the essence of Berlin was, as far as the Allies were concerned, that it was a free city. Everybody was allowed to go anywhere. But because of the wall, the West Berliners had to have permission, and it was very difficult for them to get across. But we insisted on having our flag tours. The Russians had flag tours as well. They used to come over. I went on a number of flag tours, really to see what it was like, go out to the border with East Germany and just creep across just to see what would happen. And the flag tour officers were obviously more than that. They were looking out for stuff that they wanted to find. Then on the other hand, there were the missions into East Germany, which were a totally different matter. They were run by an organization called Bricksmith. The French had a mission as well, and the Americans had a mission. But these were missions to show that the Allies had freedom in East Germany as well. But of course, those operations were very much intelligence-seeking operations. And I have to say, personnel who conducted those operations were incredible. Not only were they expert at undercover work, but they had an enormous amount of courage. They'd go out and they would go right up to the Russian areas, seeking out where their military were, what sort of tanks they had, finding out as much information as they could about the Russian military capability. Yeah, very brave.
Yeah, the French and the US had personnel in their military liaison missions killed on some of those patrols. The British not there, but yeah, very brave.
And the British were just brilliant at it. I think that's, rather like their intelligence agencies, they are absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, you would say that, wouldn't you, David? But yes, I would agree with you there. I've interviewed a number of Bricksmith personnel, and their stories are Phenomenal, as are yours, David, as well.
No.
If you'd like to hear more about BRICSMIS and the other Allied military liaison missions, there'll be a link in the episode information. So the flag tours could only patrol East Berlin, but BRICSMIS had that wider remit where they could patrol all of East Germany as long as it wasn't one of these agreed restricted areas that they couldn't work in.
Yes. And of course, those are the ones that they'd crawl into. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think your wife had a bit of an incident with the East German border guards with your son. Could you just explain that situation?
You would bring that up, wouldn't you? My wife's never forgiven me, actually. Yeah, my son, he was the one who was with us in Berlin at that time. He, as I say, he was about 6, 7. He was invited over to East Berlin to a friend of his in the East Berlin embassy. And the problem was that my wife would take him over, drop him off in East Berlin, and then come back without him, going across the border. Of course, one of the things that the East German border guards were absolutely hot on was to make absolutely sure that anybody who went across came back, and the number of people who went across into East Berlin also came back into West Berlin, and vice versa, that one didn't take someone across who hadn't gone out. Her problem was how to leave my son in East Berlin, come back by herself, and then go back and collect him and bring him back. The first time she left him, she came across to the border, and there were the guards. They stopped her, peered into the car, and then they brought guards all the way around the car and surrounded her. And she was held there for about 20 minutes with these guards, and they finally let her go. So the next day, she was a bit worried, but she's nothing like that really fusses her. She's brilliant. She goes over and she brings my son back. This time they let her through the first part of the checkpoint and then halted her right in the middle of no man's land. And that time they kept her there for an hour, as they kept her under guard, searchlights, because it was at night, searchlights absolutely on the car. Finally, they let her go. And the first thing she did was to come straight to my office. I was there with my American and French legal advisor opposite numbers. And she came in and she told us what had happened. And we said, this is very good, because we wondered what would happen. She never forgave me for that.
So she was the guinea pig for testing out some legal theory there.
Yeah, absolutely. To see exactly what would happen. So,
yeah. Brilliant. French are often forgotten about as being one of the occupying powers in West Berlin. What would they like to work with?
Oh, very good. Yeah. In fact, my opposite number, he came from Strasbourg. There was a lot of German within his family anyway, and he had that very interesting mix of French-German. He was very good indeed. He'd been in Berlin for years and years. Normally, with the Americans and ourselves, we were posted out for 2 or 3 years to do a posting there. But he'd been there for a number of years and was well used to all the situations. So if one got into really hot water, the first thing one did was to get hold of Pierre and say, Pierre, what was your experience back when? And he'd come up with the answers. Yes, the French were great. And I mean, that was always interesting, because every year there was an Allied parade. The Americans was the 4th of July, the French were 14 Juillet, and we were on the Queen's birthday. So we had military parades in Berlin. And of course, the military all tried to outdo each other in terms of their smartness and the vehicles and men that they had on parade. The French were always very keen to make sure that they were up with everybody else. And I remember one occasion they brought in some parachute troops, and they had 3 of them jump over West Berlin, which was quite remarkable, given the fact that nobody was allowed to fly over West Berlin. And all three of them landed absolutely directly in front of the French commandant. So I don't think anyone ever beat that for an Allied parade. It was also part and parcel of making sure that the West Berliners knew that we were there to protect them and to fight for them in their real hardship of trying to see their families over in East Berlin, trying to keep their businesses going with goods and transit coming up and down the corridors, doing their business via flights in and out. So it was very important to keep in very close contact with the West Berliners. And part of that was why we had these representational houses, so that one would meet with the West Berliners, find out their problems and talk with them. And the Allied parades were very important from that perspective.
What were the Americans like to work with?
Great. So often people think, American military can be hard, but we never came across that at all. They were very sure of themselves, the Americans. They were equally as responsive to the Russians as anyone else. I remember one reception. I've forgotten when they had it. It was during the détente with the Russians after the Afghan war, because they also started to get into détente. And they had an afternoon cocktail party. And it was a time when the Americans were going through a cutback. So instead of the normal champagne glass, it was Sekt in Berlin, a sort of equivalent to champagne, they had these plastic glasses where you had the stems separated from the tops. And the Russians were all invited. I still have a photograph, actually, of it. The Russians were all invited, and they were very détente. Everybody was very friendly, welcoming, everybody trying to get on with each other again. The Russians were slightly nervous, and they were twisting these glasses in their hands one by one. The stem separated from the bowl. They just walked out. They thought this was the Americans winding them up. It took quite a long time for the Americans to get the Russians to understand this was a cutback problem, not a policy problem.
Wow. Diplomatic incident over plastic champagne glasses.
Absolutely. It was so Berlin. It was the bizarre part of Berlin.
Yeah. Brilliant. Because I think that incident features in one of your books that I've been reading, but I think you assign it to the British rather than to the Americans in there.
Yes, I did. Yes. I thought that would be more diplomatic to assign it to the British.
But now we know the truth.
Now you know the truth, yes.
Were you ever involved in any sort of disciplinary issues with the British troops or incidents that you had to deal with?
But that was the actual discipline was left to the army, and they had their own army legal advisors there. But we did get involved from time to time. There was one classic occasion when one of the soldiers up in Gatow had taken an army personnel carrier, smashed through the hangar doors, and driven down the main route towards the wall. Well, the British had sent out the MPs to try and stop him, and he ran straight over the MP van that put itself across the road, straight through them. Fortunately, no one was killed. Careered on down the Heerstrasse. The Germans sent out 2 police cars. He went straight through them. Finally, we were getting really worried because he was heading straight for the wall, and there was no indication that he was going to stop. We were getting prepared because this was, again, nighttime. I was woken up and we were discussing how exactly we were going to approach the Russians about this, to warn them what was going to happen and not to open fire on him as he came through. Finally, the West German police managed to get about half a dozen of their police cars in place. They'd formed a V echelon and gradually put on their brakes and just slowed him down, and he finally had to stop. So the MPs were raced to the spot and immediately arrested him. And of course, the first question was, why on earth did he do it? He said, I was trying to get home to mummy. which showed the sort of state he was in. His court-martial was quite interesting, actually, because one of the questions that was put to him was why he smashed through the hangar doors instead of just opening them up. And he said, I thought I'd make too much noise. It was a typical Berlin, again, totally bizarre situation that could have created something really serious going through the wall. The East German guards would certainly have opened fire unless we managed to get the Russians to stop it.
Absolutely. I was researching a similar incident in 1974 where apparently a US soldier drove a Patton tank through into East Berlin or East Germany. It wasn't clear from the news reports, but yeah, it could have been, as you say, it could well have been a really serious incident. We were talking, and it seems like quite a while back, about Spandau, and I'd like to talk to you about prisoner number 7. Rudolf Hess. So this is Hitler's deputy Führer in there. He was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, but it was commuted to life imprisonment.
That was interesting. Hess was Hitler's deputy, and he'd flown over to England in 1941 to try and get the Brits to reach some accommodation with Hitler prior to Hitler going in and invading Russia. Hess had actually co-written Mein Kampf with Hitler when they were in prison after the Munich Putsch. So he was totally responsible for the atrocities that the Nazis committed, even though he wasn't actually in Berlin or in the dictatorship during most of the war. The Russians wanted to sentence him to death at the Nuremberg trials, but because he'd actually come over to Britain, we wanted to commute that to life imprisonment. So the Russians said, well, have him in prison, but he will stay there for life. And that's exactly what they did. They refused to let him out. We continually made representations to the Russians to release him, but they wouldn't do it. Now, Spandau was another curious place. As I said earlier, it was this 600 personnel prison, absolutely empty, except for this set of cells that Hess was kept in. And there were, the prison was administered by the 4 powers, the Russians, the Brits, the Americans, and the French. And each month, the guard was changed. Military guard going into the prison every month, formal sort of military handover. And the warders were the same. There were Russian warders to deal with him and British warders. The governors were in charge. The lawyers were also in charge. And we used to meet up in Spandau to discuss the problems of Hess. For instance, the visits by his widow and his son. He quite often had illness, and he would have to be transported to the British military hospital, which was in the same sector as Spandau. That in itself was absolutely bizarre, because all the governors had to go with Hess to the hospital. So you had 4 governors' cars, plus the military escort for Hess, plus the vehicle in which Hess was with the warders alongside him. You had this sort of column of cars going from Spandau Prison to the British military hospital to take him to have his treatment. Absolutely bizarre. The Russians were very difficult about it. They didn't want him to be outside prison at all. And they had curtains in his vehicle, so he couldn't see out, he couldn't see anything. I remember that on one occasion, he'd been particularly unwell, and he'd been in hospital for some time, and he was lying in bed, and said that he really needed to have some sort of walkabout. Now, that the hospital roof was flat, so I took him up to the hospital roof for a walkabout, and it was the first time he'd seen Berlin since he left Berlin in 1941. It was quite extraordinary. I got into most enormous trouble with the Russians over that. and they actually cut out his visits for a number of months, but we managed to persuade them in the end to have them back. But they hated him, and he wasn't actually there when Hitler invaded Russia. They knew that Mein Kampf had already predicted that's what Hitler wanted to do, so Hess was absolutely in favor of that. But he didn't want the Brits to still be at war with Nazi Germany when they went into Russia, because I think he foresaw the problems that would happen if Germany had to fight on two fronts.
Did he comment at all about the skyline when he went up on the hospital roof?
Yes, he knew what the American satellite dishes were for and listening dishes, because he was keen on astronomy and also was very up on satellite communications, space, and that intrigued him. But he knew exactly what they were for, exactly what they were for. He was an extraordinary man. He was dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. He hadn't changed one bit. When I first went in to see him, he was sitting down. He was struggling to get up because he was well into his 80s then. And I went to help him, and he stopped me and he said, "No, I'll do it myself." Spoke very good English. He had his window open in his cell, slept with just a sheet. He was fanatical about his health, although, the problems with it. And I remember on one occasion, all his television programs were vetted. He wasn't allowed to see anything about Germany, the Nazis. But he had one evening seen one about the gypsies, which had slipped through, and asked what he thought of that program. He said, "Gypsies, pah." He hadn't changed one iota.
Did you have any other sort of exchanges with him? Did you get any? I can't imagine he was much into small talk, to be fair.
No, not at all. No one wasn't allowed to talk to him about the Nazi era or anything like that. It was a question of making sure that if he was ill, our job is to make absolutely sure that the Russians would agree to him being taken to hospital. They treated him extraordinarily badly, of course, when they were during their month. And they were very difficult about Hess. Meetings with the Russians in Spandau were very difficult. Although I think the Russian governor, once you'd left business, the Russian governor became, as it were, a sort of Mother Russia Russian. Although you dealt with them very carefully indeed, one was able to get on to a sort of much more personal relationship with the Russians. And he was a very interesting guy. I remember when we left Berlin, my wife and I, we had a big reception and we invited the Russians to it to say farewell. And he knew I had 3 sons. He came up to me and he gave me a bag wrapped in brown newspaper, and I opened it up, and there were 3 Russian soldiers' belts for your children, he said. That was the curious thing about the Russians. I like them enormously, and it's just sad that one has to treat them with a long spoon. Of course, the problems in Berlin weren't all political. One could have one's own personal problems. I remember we were driving up the corridor one night from West Germany, and the fog was absolutely horrendous. You couldn't see more than about 10, 20 feet in front of you. And those fogs used to clamp down on East Germany, that flat, wet land. We really found it very difficult to find our way. And we came up behind a lorry, one of the old East German lorries, sort of battered and smoke pouring out, and followed him. One of the problems we had, of course, was we knew at some stage he was going to come off the motorway before we came up to checkpoint Bravo. And knowing that we weren't allowed to come off the motorway at all, it was quite hairy, making sure that we could follow him, but at the same time make sure we didn't follow him off the motorway. Suddenly he started to turn left. And we wondered, is this the right turning or not? And we were beginning to think perhaps it is right. And then his arm came out of the window and he waved us on to go straight, which you think, here's an East German. The thing that he would normally have done in one's own mind was to have actually led you off the motorway and got you into trouble. But no, here was this guy, knew we were all in trouble in this dreadful fog and helped us out. Wonderful.
That's a great story. Great story. I guess some of these fogs were due to the lignite coal that they were using, and a number of people say there was quite a unique smell around Berlin from this coal, because obviously smoke doesn't respect international borders.
No, absolutely not. And the East Germans used lignite, cheap coal. The West Berliners had to import theirs. But that lignite coal was horrific. It would belch yellow out of the chimneys and it would flood over Berlin. Curiously enough, I developed a sore throat and it lasted months. And in the end, Carrie said, look, you've got to go and see a doc about this. So I went to the doc at the military hospital and he looked at me and he said, I noticed you sitting there. You're a mouth breather. You breathe through your mouth. He said, what you're doing is you're breathing in all the lignite. He said, no wonder you've got a sore throat. He said, you just got to get on with it. So that was that. But it was absolutely horrific. And of course, with that lignite pouring over West Berlin as well as the East were the crows. One of the odd things about Berlin that one remembers are the crows. They used to circle around West Berlin because there was nothing over in East Berlin to come, but the heat in West Berlin kept them circling. And one of the really amusing things was every Christmas, Boxing Day, the military wing of the military government and the civilian wing of the military government met in the snow for a hockey match where we played with a football and hockey sticks. The British commandant, military of course, had to play one half for the army and one half for the British military government. And I remember he suffered an absolutely immense collision and was flattened in the middle of the field. We crowded round him as he recovered, and he opened his eyes and he looked up above him in horror. He said, oh my God, he said, it's the end. And of course he'd seen all these crows circling around him.
Brilliant. Now, you've taken some of the experiences that you had in Berlin into some books that you've written. Can you just explain why you decided to branch into fiction?
Yeah, sure. We've done a lot of work on anti-money laundering around the world. And suddenly my granddaughter, she was, I think, about 10 then, at school, had been doing James Bond for her English lessons. Quite why, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, she'd told her teacher that her grandfather was actually a spy. And her teacher had said, well, you can't tell these sort of stories, Amelia. This isn't right. So she told me this. And I said, well, hang on. I said, I'll make sure that this is all put right. And if you like, I'll come down and talk to your school about spies. And the head teacher thought this was quite interesting. So anyway, I go down and I talk to them about spies. And Carrie and I, when we left, we thought, do you know something? It's very interesting because of the women in the spy fiction. There aren't too many of them. And why don't we write about a woman in spy fiction? Then we thought, of course, let's do something really different and let's have a Russian. So we set up the world of Katya as a Russian spy. And again, I've always been interested in that period between 1989 and about 2010, 2015, when there was that period of glasnost, perestroika, where we were beginning to get together with Russia, the West and Russia were beginning to get together. There was actually hope on the horizon that we might all get on. Economies were moving. But then on the other hand, of course, you had the mafias growing in Russia. You had all the capital flight coming out of Russia. And the problems started beginning to develop. We thought that in order to create that period, we would have an international intelligence agency that included the Russians, the Brits, the Americans, French. So Katya became an agent in that intelligence agency, which we called the G8, because at that time, the 8 countries, including Russia, were part of the G8 Economic International Organization. So that was how Katya was born. And we wrote a trilogy of Katya's adventures. And then we decided that it would be very interesting to write about Lesky, was Katya's immediate Russian boss. So we decided to write a story about how Lev Leviatsky worked in Berlin before he ever met Katya. Although actually he meets Katya in this book because she's age 6 at that time. But Lev Leviatsky is a political advisor in Berlin opposite the American political advisor. The story's built around the Afghan war. Lev Leviatsky, Russia is what he lives for. He's not really in favor of the communist regime. He has to go along with it for as long as he can so that eventually he can build what he sees as Mother Russia for the Russians. He wants to get his wife out of East Germany, East Berlin, into West Berlin. The American has a girlfriend in East Berlin. He wants to get her out into West Berlin. So what we have is this clash between the two over the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. But at the same time, can they get together to make a deal that each one can get the other out of East Berlin into the West? And that's what the story is about, and it's called Cold Protocol.
Right, and I'll be adding links to these books in the episode information so people can explore those and buy those. David, is there anything that we've missed out about your experiences in West and East Berlin?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, and thank you very much, because you've been absolutely great. Your questions have really led me on, which is really you, because it's a long time ago and memories can fade, but memories of Berlin are pretty stark, actually, I think. Yeah. No, it's been very kind of you. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And yeah, it's been great fun. Loved listening to your stories. And I know the listeners will love them as well. So thank you very much for coming on Cold War Conversations.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War Conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.